And in task 1, there's a little bit more analytical skill involved. So less writing, it's shorter, and more thinking. Now here's the format of task 1 is to describe some visual information, a graph, a table, a chart, a process, a diagram, a map. They suggest 20 minutes. Now remember, the writing exam is 60 minutes. They suggest 40 minutes for the longer 250-word task 2 essay. And then for the shorter one, task 1, they suggest 20 minutes. So here's an example. The first chart below shows how energy is used in an average Australian household. The second chart shows the greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to look at these different charts, but that's sort of the format of the question. Now, why is this task difficult? It's difficult if you're not great in math. It's difficult if you are sometimes challenged with spatial or visual reading, so looking at graphs and charts. And at some point, it requires analysis. So you can see that it's very different to task 1. Task 1 is word-based. Task 2, sorry. They ask you a question about the environment, about education, not much about politics, but a lot about the environment, a lot about education, a lot about social media, and they want your opinion. They want to see that you can argue things in a logical manner. These 2 writing tasks represent 2 ways of thinking and communicating on paper. Whereas here, we're going to rely not just on logic, but on some analysis. You've actually got to look at this chart and make some comparisons. And when you compare, you ultimately analyze and then come up with your thoughts. Let me tell you right up front, what's the most difficult? The most difficult part for students is determining what to write about in a very short amount of time. You have just a few minutes to decide. I'm going to suggest we find 3 things to talk about. Let's look at the trajectory. The first one is net positive. It generally goes higher from the beginning to the end. Also here, it ends higher than it begins. What about the next one? It ends marginally. Marginally is a great word for the IELTS. Marginally higher is just a little bit higher. And the last one is higher. All 4 modes of transportation increase. Now look at these 2. So this is a roads and rail. Rail starts higher, but ends lower. So these are the only 2 that switch positions. That's the second observation I made. Then the other thing I'm interested in is how much of an increase. Interestingly, 3 show big progress, 1 almost none. I can then decide, well, the one that didn't show progress might be the most interesting to talk about because the other 3 did. Or you can talk about the 3. My 3 paragraphs. So these are the body paragraphs. And what we do, once I have that, then I put it into a sentence. All 4 modes of transportation show an increase between, and then we'll put the years. The most difficult part here is the first sentence. Then you can just describe the graph after that in detail. The second one, 2 modes of transportation change positions during this period. Now, we don't have to say the years again because we've already mentioned it, but the most important issue is getting these first sentences. First of all, identifying. So we've identified an idea. Then we write it. The other thing you could choose to look at is areas of great increase or a big decrease or decline. The late 1970s represented a period of great volatility. And then what you'll do is then just describe what that volatility is. 2 of these showed a precipitous or maybe just a significant decline, whereas the 2 others, the pipeline and the water, showed just the opposite, a rather steep or significant increase. So I think that can be interesting. Let me ask you, do you see how I did that? I'm going to ask you to do it. In the first time, I'm going to give you 6 minutes. So I'm going to give you the chart now. So just really carefully read the directions. This is what I did. General trend, highest to lowest, change positions, biggest jumps. These are the things that you'll want to look for. Ready? So here's what you're going to do. Identify 3 interesting trends, write them down, and then if you can remember the question you asked to find the trend.
I wrote down 3 sentences. The overall gratification points represent that most people were pleased with the service that Peveril Center provided. This is the first one. The chart shows that the patients were able to easily book appointments from Peveril Center. The last one is the Longston Center had the lowest point of satisfaction in response to patient concerns.
Excellent sentence and good point. Your second point's quite strong. The first point is, I would say, your weakest point, because you mentioned service is strongest. Read the first point again, please.
The overall gratification points represent that most people were pleased with the service that Peveril Center provided.
Okay, so the phrasing is a bit awkward, and I'll help you with this. So awkward style. But the other thing is the only time service is used is in the doctors. The problem is you've used a specific word in one of the categories, which is service. So it's going to confuse people. And if you look at doctor service, they're almost equal. So that's the one that's equal. So that's a confusing point, actually. Gratification is probably not the right word. Satisfaction is. Gratification has different meanings, and it can also mean of a sexual nature. So I think satisfaction is the one you want to use here. Here's what we learned. We want to look at the highs and the lows in general. Start with the highs and the lows. Here's the high. That's the composite score. Here's the low. That's the one thing. So we can look down. So we can look vertical and parallel or horizontal. So here's the vertical view. These two stand out. Now, what about horizontal? Here we have the biggest disparity. So if you want to talk about using nice words, disparity is a great word. The largest disparity exists in the response to concerns with more than a 5-point, watch this, a 5-point differential. Let's move on. The other thing that was interesting, I thought, was these all scored well and were all similar. Everyone likes doctors. I found those two. Now, if you wanted to make a point of this is like the second most, dynamic. So you have 2 things, the lowest, the highest, and then you can go horizontal. Look horizontal. I think you could do this one and have a very interesting idea, or this one and have a very interesting idea. So you have 4, I think, really interesting points, and I think most of you found them. When you have a graph like this, vertical, and then look, you can compare horizontal. 2 ways to analyze to find it, and you can do this very quickly. It doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't take a lot of, let's say intelligence, but I think we need to talk about it for you to see these, and then you start to do them instinctively. Let me just make the point one more time. If you come up with an interesting point, it's easy to write about it because there's a lot there. It just writes itself. The most difficult part is the one we're doing now. My goal is to increase your confidence. I can tell you, I've done these a lot with smart students, and it's the same obstacle every time. I don't know what to write about. Everyone says the same. Interesting points are easy to write. You'll never run out of things to say. And guess what? Once you describe that point, you're already at 150. You have a short introduction, 3 points. You just describe what you see, you're at 150, you're done.